As Prime Minister Modi gets ready for his bilateral conversation with President Barack Obama, this trip has shifted gears now from the showmanship aspect to questions around what the substance will be. There have been a series of meetings between the Prime Minister and American CEOs, but can Narendra Modi resurrect the Indian story globally? That's the big question. Can he deliver on specifics? Can he bring investors back? Mr. Modi has also made his first foreign policy articulation before an influential audience at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. Joining me now is Chairman and Managing Director of the Mahindra Group, as well as somebody who serves on the Board of Global Advisors to the Council on Foreign Relations, Anand Mahindra. Pleasure to be talking to you here in New York. Let me start by asking you, this trip has already been overloaded with a huge amount of expectation. The phrase rock star reception has been used by the media again and again, in part because of just filling out the garden, Madison Square Garden. But in terms of the specifics, it begins now. The real work begins now. What did you take away from what Narendra Modi said at the Council on Foreign Relations?
I was very impressed. I've been a global board of advisor member for some time now, and I've had the opportunity to sit in on a number of such meetings that they've had with heads of state. And let's face it, Mr. Modi hasn't had much chance to acquire expertise in global diplomacy, in dealing with audiences as sophisticated as this. And I have to say, I was pleasantly surprised at how well he negotiated this audience. I've seen this audience be very rambunctious, very challenging, very contentious. I turned to the two people on either side of me, business moguls in their own right in the US.
Indians or Americans?
No, Americans. And I asked them, and they just gave a completely unequivocal thumbs up. I had asked them before, what are you expecting? And I was very pleased to hear their expectations are also not big reforms. They were saying, look, we want constant, steady process and progress. And if he delivers that and shows us a trajectory of change, we're happy. Even on things like the Vodafone tax treaty, they want resolution and they want a promise of no such recurrence in the future. So I think we have it to some extent. We are misunderstanding the nature of the expectations here. The expectations are not all unilaterally for big bang reforms. They are for a man who's on a mission, who's going to prove he's going to keep making change consistently. To that extent, frankly, he met everyone's expectations this morning.
But look at some of the, in a sense, the comments he made at the Madison Square Garden address when he was talking to 20,000 members of the Indian diaspora. And he promised a new India, a different kind of India. That's not a small reform, that's a really gigantic promise. And beyond the rhetoric, what is the substance of that promise for you?
You know, you began by asking me a question on business and getting down to the substance. I'll tell you, I have a very different view of what this trip is about. Everybody's going to ask questions about the US-India relationship, what is the progress we've made, and geopolitical issues, trade issues. I think this trip is about Narendra Modi. It's about Narendra Modi coming onto the world stage.
It's a kind of coming out of Modi.
It's a debut. It's a bold new politician making an impact. You know, Shakespeare said all the world's a stage, but the world's largest stage is New York, literally and metaphorically. Rockefeller Center, Madison Square Garden. And remember the old Sinatra song, if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. That's what he's out to prove. That I may have been a tea seller, I may have been somebody who hasn't been in high power for so long in the national government, but I know what I'm doing. I know how to get people behind me, and he's convinced people here that he's a man on a mission, both Indians and Americans. But what I was very pleased about, and to me, the purpose of this trip is served, is that he went to Madison Square Garden and in front of a large Indian diaspora, he made promises. He made promises about changing India. He made promises कि मैं आपको कभी अवसर नहीं दूंगा सर नीचा करने के लिए. Very heavy promise. And I love that because I think this is his audience. His ultimate audience is India and global Indians.
But what about delivering on those promises?
Well, that's the whole question. I think if he's made that promise, he has to deliver. I am more sanguine about him delivering on promises now that he's made that promise in Madison Square Garden than the promises he makes to President Obama. Promises you make to fellow global politicians can be sacrificed at the altar of expediency. But promises you make in Madison Square Garden to the Indian diaspora, and it's been broadcast all around the world, I will not let you down. I was very heartened. To me, the purpose of this trip is sort of achieved just by that promise.
The media has been accused by some commentators of overhyping this visit, of in a sense adding to what's being called the hysteria around it. You've come here very often, you've seen many prime ministers come to the United States of America. Have you ever seen this kind of reaction, and if it's different, what explains it?
You know, we always underplay charisma, and we always say that this is some kind of faff, this is not the substance. If you look at some of the most successful presidents in a country like America, the most powerful country in the world, charisma has gone a long way in ensuring the election of those leaders and their success afterwards in building coalitions. Whether it's Obama, whether it's Reagan, whether it's Clinton. And I tweeted yesterday that I think what came out in Madison Square Garden was evidence that as Indians, we've been hungering for a leader with charisma and vision. Now, of course, that raises expectations sky high. So the media is not the only one that's been a victim of hype and hype is the wrong word, of expectation, of energy. If you look at American commentators, we're very cautiously saying, look, if nothing else, this man has enormous energy. So I think the frenzy, the excitement around this trip is justified. It's been a long time since India had somebody who's been able to charismatically get people behind him.
You know, the BBC New York correspondent, I was interviewing him at Madison Square Garden, and he said that it reminded him of a US presidential nomination night. And he was remembering when Clinton had made his acceptance speech at Madison Square Garden. But he also pointed out that there were parallels with Obama, that even the way Modi had been picturized in the press credentials on this giant screen, it was reminiscent of the Obama campaign. There are other parallels as well. Obama, also known for his showmanship, also known for his keen sense of his audience, but then later being accused of not delivering on every promise. So do you think Mr. Modi runs that risk?
When you raise expectations sky high, you always have that risk. By the way, I don't have such a negative view of Obama.
No, I don't, but you meet Americans who are disappointed, they expected
Americans
more and so
are
on.
So polarized.
Yeah.
All you have to do is turn your head 180 degrees and you'll get a different view.
True.
So a comparison to Obama may not be such a bad one.
Yeah.
The jury is still out, I frankly think. And the jury will be out on Mr. Modi and delivering. But I'm glad you said it was like a presidential or nomination night, like a convention. My daughter said the same thing when she saw it yesterday. And she said when the balloons came down, she said this is like an American convention. And so be it. This is a man who says, I want to make India achieve global standards. And I'm not saying American conventions are the best in the world. But frankly, he borrows from the best. I think the man's brain is like a sponge. He just looks around and he borrows the best ideas, absorbs it from wherever they come. I was astounded by the astuteness of some of his answers to the difficult questions at the CFR. I believe you were watching too.
Yes.
And, he sidestepped questions with great adroitness.
When asked which leader he wants to emulate.
That shows that despite his practicality, despite his desire to excite, despite his desire to be a salesman to the crowd there, he knew when to step back and be a good old-fashioned diplomat. There are some questions I won't answer. I think the question on China, he very politely said no, international arbitration. He sidestepped the question on who he's learned from brilliantly. Yeah. So I was very enthused. I said, this man in some other avatar of his in the past has been a leader as well.
Do you talking about the past, do you agree with the theory that Mr. Modi, the Prime Minister, is very different from Mr. Modi, the campaigner?
Wouldn't you have to be? Wouldn't you have to be? I think if you're somebody, any kind of leader, you have to be somebody who is a chameleon to some extent. You have to be able to evolve. You have to be able to decide now what's the task. When you're out on the frenzy of the campaign and what you do then, naturally has to be very different. It's a cliche by now, for example, that when leaders come to power, they have to become a little more move to the center.
Yeah, move to the center. Yeah.
And so that's a cliche by now. Now that's too simplistic, but I'm sure Mr. Modi knows how he has to evolve and which colors he has to wear.
There have been comparisons in the media drawing parallels between Narendra Modi and Margaret Thatcher, Modi and Reagan. But when you look at the few months in office and the first budget and Mr. Modi's approach to economics, it would seem that he's not so much a free market reformer as he is an enabler of a business environment, but where the enabling would remain through the vessel of the government. Does that concern you as an industrialist?
You know why it doesn't concern me is because that's exactly the way I've been running my group for years. I don't think we could have grown if I really thought that I could bring dramatic change overnight or use an axe, wield a scalpel. We have, you know, one of our old mottos, an old tagline in Mahindra & Mahindra has been continuity and change. I think that's what he's doing. He understands that this is not something where he can go in and be a surgeon. This is a federal government. He's mentioned that time and again in his speeches here. What I like about him, and which I have said is my philosophy too, is not big bang reform, but a reform a day, a small reform a day, will go much further in changing India. As a businessman who's dealt in India's Byzantine environment for a long time, I just want business to become easier in the small ways, not necessarily the ways Wall Street is looking for, big bang labor reform, FDI in retail and so on. You know, if you can just make join the dots, that's what he has to do. Join the dots for small entrepreneurs in India and people like me. If I give you a small example, Make in India is not only about manufacturing and allowing investment in and giving tax offs. We've been trying to make our aircraft here from a company we bought in Australia. And you might say, well, is that about land? Is that about capital? Is that about red tape? It's about the DGCA. The DGCA has some antiquated rule where it doesn't allow you to put more than 4 passengers into our plane, which is an 8-seater, a piston engine. It's an antiquated rule. The laws, the kind that Mr. Modi spoke about in Madison Square Garden. If he just does away with that kind of law and understands that manufacturing is not only about the place where you're located, but it's about joining the dots and making all these regulations work together. If he can do that, and every day in a slow incremental way, I'd be very happy.
The specific irritants when it comes to economics between Washington and Delhi, there seems to be no immediate resolution to them, whether it's the intellectual property rights issue, where pharma companies will say you don't respect IPR, Indians will say we have the right to make cheap generic drugs. You've got the nuclear liability stalling the operationalization of the nuclear agreement. You've got the retrospective tax that continues to concern people. And you've got Mr. Modi announcing visas on arrival for the Americans, but the Indians saying, where's the reciprocity? What about our H-1B visas? What about our L visas? Do you see any of these irritants actually getting resolved?
They're not going to go away easily, and anyone who says they will go away easily doesn't understand the landscape here. It's going to take a while for America to really give India the respect it deserves. We should not be under the illusion that one trip is going to do this. I studied here a long time. I've spent a lot of time here, a lot of business here. What I've understood is that America respects 2 things. They respect size and scale, number 1. They respect anyone who is truly large, as they do China. And they also respect those who are allies with them. Frankly, it boils down to that. You're either an ally or you've got size and scale. What I think the real opportunity for India here is we can be both. China will always get America's respect, but mixed with a kind of caution and apprehension. They will never be allies. But India has the opportunity to show that it can be both an ally and somebody who you can respect in size, whether it's military or economic. We have to go about our business of growing our economy. When we grow at consistently more than 7% a year, we will get their attention. Irritants will suddenly magically have a way of being resolved at the table. And I think we also have to step up to bat and show that we are allies. Now, I think he did a very good job in the United Nations of not making it look like I'm simply going to knee-jerk join the airstrikes on ISIS. He raised it to a different level. He said there has to be a UN approach, a comprehensive convention. And that's a clever thing. But at some point we're going to have to show, like he did today very strongly, more strongly than in the UN, say that we who believe in humanity have to unite. Now he has to... But
Obama could ask him to join the coalition against the ISIS.
And I think he has to find ways which you and I may not find work. All diplomacy is not conducted in front of cameras, and you know that.
The best diplomacy is not.
The best diplomacy is not. And as long as Mr. Modi finds a way to convince the Americans, behind the scenes, if not in front of the cameras, that India stands with them in this fight against terror, then we will show that we are both an ally and an economy of size and scale that must be respected.
But do you think that part of the American-US, American-Indian equation being described as a natural partnership, which is how Narendra Modi described it in his op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, is also about America looking to create a countervailing influence to China? Are we getting caught up in the great game?
You know, we are all players in the game. So why should we be caught up in this game. We're playing the game. So we are a countervailing influence. How do we play it to our advantage? And that's what I said. You've got to show that we can be an ally and then reap the benefits of that to help grow our economy and to get the benefits of knowledge, research, technology, finance that we need from America. That is the great game. And as I said, I'm delighted to see this man who has never been on a global leadership stage seems to have the savvy to be able to do that. I think we don't have to be worried about getting caught up in the game. I think we have to play the game right.
Finally, you're also with the US-India Business Council. In the run-up to this trip, there were some American companies, including the US Chamber of Commerce, that wrote a letter to President Obama saying that they have a lot of expectation from the Modi government, but they're worried about what they called the confusing messaging, the mixed messaging coming. Now, there's an expectation here. You said it's not big ticket, but there's still an expectation here that the economic philosophy of Mr. Modi will be very different from that of, let's say, the Manmohan Singh government. But India's position at the World Trade Organization, at the WTO, which he was asked about at the CFR talk as well, is that something you support, that food security and reducing trade barriers has to go together?
Absolutely. We support a think tank in Mumbai called Gateway House, which has come out with a very clear position on this, and which I have looked at and used to educate my own opinion. And I think they're right. What he said, again, articulated very well by him this morning was, he said unequivocally, we are for trade facilitation. But you have to understand that we cannot ignore food security. Now, where I think India needs to do better is not to be seen as a lone ranger on this. The fact is that this idea of food security is and ought to be important to a number of developing countries. Now the question is, we've got to build a coalition and not only look like we're the people with our foot stuck in the door. We've got to show that there are many more people who want that door, who have their foot in the door and want the two issues linked. So I think we have to be a little smarter in how we show that these two issues are important.
Finally, what has stood out for you of all the things that Mr. Modi has said and done here so far? What stood out for you?
It was the Madison Square Garden address. As I said, this was his debut. This was his debut party on the world stage. And I believe he's raised expectations to a level where he will have to deliver. And I will be waiting along with every other Indian in the world, cheering and hoping that he will deliver.
Anand Mahindra, pleasure talking to you.